Hey everybody, it's me again, Velton Shell. Thanks for taking some time to join me today. Today I'm going to do something that I started a couple of weeks ago. I started talking about the new book that I'm writing called Leadership Dynamics 52 Principles, and give you an overview of some of the ideology behind what I'm writing and what I am teaching and training as I travel around the country and speak to different organizations. Today's area that we're going to focus, I mean, it sounds a little cliche-ish and it sounds like, oh yeah, I know what that means, but in reality, in a lot of business environments, creativity can be stifled. And it can be stifled if we don't do things a little differently. And so there are four concepts that I'm going to talk about today. And the first one is pretty much should be understood, but it's not. And it says encourage out-of-the-box thinking. You know, out-of-the-box thinking means just that, a little differently, to make things uncomfortable for a lot of the people around them because it's not the norm. It's not something that you're used to. You know, I've gone to seminars where people say, to create an environment, take your watch off and hold it in your hand, okay? Now, hold it in your hand, but give it to the person next to you, and tell them that you'll see them next week and then you want it back. No, I'm just kidding. Take your watch off, put it in your hand. Take a look at down, take the time to undo your watch, put it on the other arm. Now what I want you to do is leave that watch on that arm for the next week. You're going to be uncomfortable. Why? Because you're used to looking down at the other wrist for the watch. But in reality, when you're thinking outside the box, sometimes that how you've done things in the past, it's not what's traditionally looked at as the way things should be. There are people in your organization that you're leading that have ideas, they're creative, they're looked at as even as weird or, you know, something strange about that person. But it's because they are not cut just like everybody else. They are not cut from a cookie cutter. And you don't want people like that in your organization. You get things. You know, we talk about diversity, and we usually use diversity as a term as it relates to ethnicity or relates to gender or relates to religious connotation. But diversity drills down even deeper because it's differently. You're going to stumble upon ideas. You're going to create things. You're going to invent things. When you talk about or think about people like Albert Einstein, you know, everybody talks about Albert Einstein and his quote that says, it wasn't that he failed 99 times. So he had to think outside the box. Now, I'm going to take it a step further because Albert didn't think outside the box by himself. He had a gentleman named Lewis Lattimore who worked for him, worked in his laboratory, burned out. Now, could he have done it by himself, Thomas? Sure, he might have been able to get there eventually. But because he had someone on his staff who thought outside the box, faster than he would have done it by himself. So what I'm saying to you, Mr. and Miss Leader, is that allow people on your team to be that extraordinary outside the box thinking person, that person who brings you the idea, that person who brings you the solution, that person who sets things apart to be who they really are. And that's really important. There are so many things that were invented because people thought outside of the box. You know, I talked about the light bulb. Think about the Wright brothers who invented the plane. Okay? People said, you can't fly. Man was not meant to fly. Eventually they flew. They found a way to fly. You have to allow yourself that creative ideology that now that are starting out as entrepreneurs, that are doing things differently, that are making changes in the world, that rocking out, doing some incredible stuff. But That's because they are not in that proverbial box. The internet has opened a lot of people's eyes. They are able to research a lot faster, creative, and expand our horizons. The issue or the question is, as the leader, are you also an outside the box thinker? Or are you putting fences around the people in your organization because of the vision that you have? Now, I'm not telling you that you should sacrifice your vision. You'll never hear me say that. But as leaders, we have to be willing to listen. We have to create a forum. We have to create an environment that allows people to stretch. And we'll talk about that a little further. The second point I want to make is really that, because it talks about you as the leader. You know, there was a book that I read back in the 90s, going back a ways now, yeah, C.D. Gray, I've been around for a while, and it was called The Paradigm Shift. Many times as I grew up in corporate America, I heard, well, we do it this way because we've always done it like this. Or this is the way we do it around here. Or, yeah, I understand you have a different idea, but this is not really part of who we are and what we want to do. We want to do something like this. And what ends up happening when you create an environment like that is you have the chance or opportunity to possibly fall or self-destruct because of your inability or unwillingness to change. You know, when I was in the 80s, owned the computer industry. But it was mainframe computers. In the 70s and 80s, the computers would take up this whole room. And that would be the brains of your organization, but it would take this entire room behind me to house the computers, or the computer was invented. And IBM decided that the desktop computer was a fad. It was something that was going to go away in a matter of minutes. They didn't invest any money in it. They really didn't believe in it. What ended up happening is a small company who's no longer in business now, called Compaq, almost put IBM out of business, brought them to their knees, made them crumble. Another example of that, and they're back now, but they were gone for a while, the Swiss watch manufacturers owned the market. Everybody had a watch. It was a wind-up watch, and it was the Swiss. If you had a Swiss watch, obviously you were doing pretty well because you could afford to buy a Swiss watch. Well, along came the quartz watch to rewind, or was like a battery. It perpetuated itself. You didn't have to wind it every day, and you didn't have to carry. It didn't start to lose time because it was, the spring was getting loose, and all of a sudden it slowed down, and all of a sudden you look down at your watch and it stopped. That didn't happen. The watch stopped maybe after 6 months or a year because you needed to replace the battery or the chip. The Swiss decided that they owned the market. They weren't going to change. The paradigm had shifted, but they weren't willing to shift. They almost went out of business. They lost their lion's share of the market share to companies like Timex, who invested in quartz manufacturing of watches. Computer industry. I'm sitting here right now in front of a laptop computer. I've got my iPhone here. I've got a camera in front of me from a company, and I'm broadcasting around the world from the comfort of my apartment. Now, think about it. How did this change over time? For me to broadcast and for you to see me, for you to be here in front of me, camera and some lights and things of that nature, I'd have to go to a studio. But instead of that, I can sit in this apartment overlooking the skyline of the city, and I can broadcast to you and talk to you about my book without ever leaving here. Think about a couple of things. The expense that I don't have to incur by renting studio time. Think about the fact that I can do it whenever I get ready. A digital camera. I can use the internet These things were all created when paradigms shifted. If I had, and I still have the ability to do this, if I was so stubborn that I refused to make that adjustment or make that change, I'd still be incurring the expenses. And it's not cheap. For anybody who's rented studio time, you know it's not cheap. I would have incurred the expenses of understanding how the paradigm shifts. Now, I'm not going to tell you I'm perfect because I'm far from it. When it comes to technology, I'm still learning, and I just have some great friends. You know, hats off to Shay Brown and Trevor Otts because they are bringing me a long way, and Keisha Williams and some other people, Taria Hodge, they all are working with me to help me understand as the paradigm shifts what I need to do to create an staff. These aren't my staff people, but they are. Why? Because they're part of my network. I do things to help them, they do things to help me. When we talk about paradigm shifts and we talk about leadership and we talk about staffs, everybody who's in your network has to be interchangeable. And this is a big paradigm shift. You don't have the resources to pay someone to come in and do specific things or certain things for you. But you do have a bargaining chip. You do have knowledge. You do have experience. You do have a level of expertise in a certain area. And we were on the radio this morning and Dakisha used about a paradigm shift. You're not being paid for what you sell. You're being paid more for what you know. There's more money in what you know than what you do. There's more trying to hire someone. The first person who gives has the upper hand or the opportunity to shift the paradigm to help them grow their business. So as a leader, be willing to, number one, give. Number two, to understand when the paradigm shifts, you got to get out in front of it. You know, I talked about the Swiss watches. I talked about computers. There are so many stores. All of the other companies are trying to do electric cars, but they don't all have everything that it takes. And as one company develops a new ideology or a new way of doing things, the others are differently and better. And if your business is going to grow, if your business is going to expand, as the CEO, as the leader, whether it's the total company or it's a specific area of expertise or department, you have to be willing to shift your mindset so that you can take advantage of the change to improve and increase your asset. Remember, shift your mindset to increase your asset. If you can shift your mindset, it burn up the engine. Remember the old, I'm going to take you back away. Well, it's not going to take you back a ways. But think about a manual shift car. If you run it in first gear too long, what happens? You burn out the clutch or you burn out the engine. If you run it in second gear too long, you do the same thing. Sooner or later, it's going to blow up. It's not until you hit that fourth or fifth gear where you're humming along at a top speed that you are doing and gaining the best that you can with what you got. So understand something. You're in first gear. That means there are certain things that you can do and accomplish in first gear. But to go to the next level of second gear, you got to shift. When you're in second gear, you're moving along, you're humming along, you're making the next level. And ultimately, when you get to third gear, you may be at 6 figures. If you want to get to 7 figures, you got to shift into overdrive. It means you got to change the way you look at things. You got to change the way you're thinking. You got to change sometimes your staffing levels, your focus. Are you ready for the change? The question is yours. The answer only you can answer. You've got to be ready for the change. Now, the next segment that I'm going to talk about when we talk about change is challenging the status quo. How many of you are willing to challenge the status quo? What does challenging the status quo mean, Velton? Challenging the status quo means doing things differently even when other people tell you they don't. And as I was looking at that, I was like, you know, it's challenging the status quo. You have to be a pioneer. You have to be a renegade. You have to be someone who's different than everybody else. You got to be willing, you got to have a pair. You got to be willing to do something that everybody else way to go. You know that there's gold in them there heels. And as I was writing the book, I was sitting there going, you know, challenging the status quo is not something that everybody does. But is there anybody in my network that I know that really, I was going to do this, but I did interview him for the book, so I'm hoping that he doesn't have a problem with me talking about him today. But what I did is I called a friend of mine, a guy named Victor Antonio. And I said, Victor, you know, I'm writing this book called Leadership Dynamics, 52 Principles that Every Successful Leader Understands. And when I came to this segment, I wanted to interview someone who mirrored or gave me the impression, or when I left. And he said, why would you think of me, Vel? And here's what I did. This is why I gave him the answer that I gave him. I met Victor Antonio, oh gosh, probably about 10 years ago. And he was a CEO of a corporation, and he's been in sales for many years. He's one of the top authorities on sales and marketing in the world right now. He travels all over the world speaking to major organizations on sales. But when Victor started his business, and I met him not in the beginning, but kind of in the early stages, he was doing something that nobody else was doing. What he was doing is he was developing his content, developing his ideas, developing his platform. But he was doing keynotes, he was doing training, he was doing all kinds of cutting edge stuff and posting it on YouTube for free. Yeah, I said free. F-R-E-E. He had video after video, training after training, idea after idea, thought after thought, and he was putting it all on. Listen to it, take notes, write copy, do whatever they needed to do to put it up in their offices, do training, workshops, just from the videos. And people were saying to Victor, why are you giving? Said the same thing to me at a later time. They said, give them everything you have until they can't seem to do without it. And what I learned about what Victor was doing was, before I get into some of the interview stuff, is that now he has one of the top 3, Bob Proctor and Brian Tracy. That's how much content Victor has on his site. He's getting 500,000 hits in a short time span on his YouTube channel. In addition to that, he's speaking all over the place, and he started by giving away his content on a YouTube channel. So when I sat down with Victor, I said, Vic, man, that was bold. And he said, you know, I said, why? And he said, there's a couple of things. He said, one thing is that you stretch and pull at the same time. I said, what do you mean? He said, it's kind of like a rubber band. Sometimes it stretches you, and sometimes it pulls you. He says, sometimes you're being pulled forward, and sometimes you're being stretched backwards. But when you're in that mode, in that motion, you got to have the flexibility every movement of the rubber band. And I said, wow. He said, so when I created my channel, yeah, it was stretching me to put the content out there, but it started people pulling on me because they wanted more. Without them getting a taste up front, doing. And I said, wow, that's interesting. He said, you know, he started to tell me about, he's a big Bruce Lee fan, a Bruce Lee follower. He said, Bruce Lee had a saying that sometimes you have to be willing to walk alone. You're walking alone because other people don't see it, they don't get it, they don't understand it, and they don't support it. But if they did, you got to be willing to take a chance. You got to be willing to step out there and give it everything you got, even though there's going to be a lot of naysayers. There's going to be a lot of people who challenge you. I don't see it. I think you're wasting your time. But you have to be willing to do what other people won't. There are a lot of people in this world who miss that opportunity for 1 minute that they're not willing to do something. Because most people are willing to do something. But most people are just going to do enough to be comfortable. They're not going to be... And when I was talking to Victor, we laughed because we talked, he tells a story, and I've heard the story before, but he was telling me the story about the two gentlemen who sat on their porch every day and talked to each other. And one Sunday after, in his rocking chair, as he always did on Sunday afternoon, sitting on the porch with his old hunting dog laying over on the side. And as he got closer, as walking down the road, he could hear the hunting dog going, "Arr!" And the hunting dog was just making a whole lot of noise the whole time. And as he walked up and he said, "Herman," he said, "Hey, Bobby, how you doing, man?" He said, "Don't you head to the vet?" "Nah, he'll be all right." And so he says, "Why don't you go in there and get yourself something cool to drink and come on out here and let's chop it up for a while and let's talk for a while." So he goes in the house and he gets it in. The dog is just almost like he's complaining and laying, but he's just laying there and grimacing and making a whole lot of noise. And finally he says, "Herman, I can't take it." I said, "Bobby, let me tell you something." He said, "There's nothing wrong with that dog." He said, "That dog is laying on a tack. He's just like most people. He's laying on that tack, and until it hurts enough, until it becomes so uncomfortable that he can't lay there." Heard it before, but was so appropriate for the idea, the concept of challenging the status quo. Because when you are operating inside the status quo, inside the box, it's very comfortable. It's very recognizable by the people around you and the people. It's like a system. It's almost like a regimentation. I do this, then I do this, then I do this, then I do this. And finally, you get to a certain point. But when you're operating outside of the status quo, it's uncomfortable in the beginning. It's something you're almost to the point where some people are going to say that's unreasonable. But the proof is in the pudding, as they say. The results are on the other side. The gains are there waiting for you. If you're right inside of the status quo, are limiting themselves because they're limiting themselves based on the amount of effort that people have traditionally given to be inside the status quo. To be outside, you have to give additional effort. To be outside, you've got to be different than that old hound dog. You got to get up off that tack and do something unexpected by most people. Now, if that dog had gotten up, picked up the tack and put it up on the table and then went and ran around, that's what challenging the status quo is all about. That's what my conversation with Victor was about. He talked about that because when you challenge the status quo, you've got to see the problem. Look for ways and opportunities to do something that's going to make an impact, make a difference. That's the challenge. Excuse me. Take the other person's point of view, but think it through. When you've got somebody on your team that has a point of view, they're there for a reason. Take their point of view. But God gave you a brain for you to think it through. Doesn't mean that you have to agree. A team is better than an individual in resolving issues, problems, and thinking outside the box or outside the status quo. Okay? When you think it through, decide whether or not it's a challenge that you want to accept or you don't. Attack at this point, or ever attack. But you've got to determine or discern what they are. Am I going? Am I not? But it takes a thought process. Sometimes it takes a discussion. Sometimes, how do you resolve it? Is there an answer? Do you have an answer? Or is there a short-term fix that's going to lead you to a long-term answer? I'll tell you, there's a lot more of what we talked about in our discussion as we talked about challenging the status quo. It was an amazing discussion. I loved spending some time with him. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about is, and I just mentioned it just on the surface, is encouraging collaboration. Creative outside of the boxes or fences that we put around ourselves, but our areas of expertise, times we have certain things that we do well and certain things that we don't do as well. And it's our responsibility to understand and accept the things that we do well. Say to me, what do you do? There are three things that I do, and then three things that I focus on: sales, leadership development, and customer experience. If you want somebody to focus on something outside of those three areas, I may not be your guy. But sales-oriented issues of expertise that I've honed my skills and crafts around. When I jump outside of those areas in my business, I go to other stronger, make my platform more stable. When I present it to a client, when I present it to anyone who interacts with me, I'm not willing to help us in that area. If you are willing to share that way with other people will be willing to share that way with you. If you're not, then you're going to leave yourself in a situation where you're going to... You've heard us on the morning show. And on the morning show, we've been talking about an event that we're going to be doing in a couple of weeks called Black and Influential. It's an opportunity for us to collaborate. Events that are more industry focused in the hospitality industry, which I'm where I came out of. I attend events that are leadership focused. I attend events that are customer experience oriented events. I watch things and I look at them in energy. And they are the areas which you're spending your time and energy, giving you the return that you need to drive your business forward. So collaboration is key. It's not about you, it's about us. It's not about you, it's about them. You know, Phil Jackson was one of my favorite coaches. You know, he was the coach of the Chicago Bulls. Good teams become great when the players trust each other enough to replace me with we. Good teams become great when the players learn to trust each other enough that they can replace me with we. Operation. Do your players trust each other enough to replace me with we? I'm Velton Shaw, that every successful leader understands. And I hope that you have learned some things. I hope I've been able to give you a couple of nuggets that you can take away today. If you want to learn more about the book, you can go to my website, veltonshaw.com. Thanks again for tuning in. I wish you the best.